Here in the North Winnipeg neighborhood of West Kildonan, you will find one of the richest deposits of history in Western Canada. Tucked between Main Street and the Red River, and running roughly from Kildonan Church in the north to St. John's Park in the south, this 3-mile-long stretch of land known as Seven Oaks is where the seeds of Western society were planted on the Canadian prairie. These narrow plots were the first farms in the West, and it was on these fields that the battle was fought between the old order of the fur trade and the new age of agriculture and commerce, where the religious, educational, and civic traditions of the British sunk their roots before spreading west, and where the political destiny of the Canadian West was decided. Perhaps the most amazing thing about Seven Oaks is that so much happened in such a small area. Much of the evidence is still here, and anyone with the inclination to go for a walk can see and touch the remnants of a momentous period in Canadian history. Here on Main Street, the modern world rushes past a monument to one of the first historic events to take place in Seven Oaks, the famous battle between the Selkirk settlers and Maytee buffalo hunters in 1816. The battle, like the area, takes its name from a prominent grove of oak trees that stood here at the time.
The Battle of Seven Oaks is one of the most significant events in Western Canadian and certainly Manitoba history. It was an event that had repercussions that lasted for decades and arguably even up until the present time.
The colony had been established by Lord Selkirk, a Scottish nobleman, in response to the plight of poor tenant farmers who were being pushed off their lands to make room for sheep grazing. Selkirk wanted to offer them the opportunity to start a new life in the New World, and so he established Red River, the first agricultural colony on the Canadian prairie. However, in addition to being a philanthropist, Selkirk was also the largest shareholder in the Hudson's Bay Company, and his colony represented a strategic business move. Its location so close to the forks of the Red and Assiniboine rivers placed it right next to Fort Gibraltar, a major outpost of his rivals at the Northwest Company. Selkirk also had a fort built next door to Fort Gibraltar. Called Fort Douglas, its location only fueled suspicions among the Northwest Company and its Maytee suppliers that the colony's chief purpose was to disrupt their fur trade along the Red River. The situation was certain to lead to conflict, and the simmering rivalries for land and power came to a head on June 19, 1816.
In June of 1816, after various conflicts back and forth between the Maytee and the settlers and the Maytee and the Hudson's Bay Company, a group of Maytee were crossing near the settlement from the upper Assiniboine to the lower Red River, transporting goods, when they were met by Governor Semple from Fort Douglas and 22 of his men. In the resulting conflict, we're not quite sure who fired the first shot, but the end result was that Semple and 20 men were killed and 1 Maytee.
The Selkirk settlers abandoned the colony and fled to Norquay House, while the victorious alliance of the Northwest Company and Maytee celebrated what looked like the early demise of Lord Selkirk's dream. Little did they know that the Scottish lord himself would soon arrive to take control of his colony's fortunes. The Battle of Seven Oaks in June of 1816 seemed to mark the end for the fledgling Selkirk settlement. But the following year, Lord Selkirk himself arrived to visit his colony and took matters firmly in hand.
When Lord Selkirk arrived in Western Canada the next year, the first thing he did when he arrived at Fort William was to arrest a number of the senior partners of the Northwest Company and have them sent back to Eastern Canada for trial. He proceeded on to Red River, where he was instrumental in helping the settlers, the returned settlers, to reestablish the colony there. One of the most significant things he did when he arrived in the colony was to negotiate a treaty in 1817 with Chief Peguis and his people in the Red River Valley.
Once law and order had been restored and their homesteads rebuilt, the Selkirk settlers were able to turn their attention to their spiritual needs, which had been neglected through 5 years of struggle and conflict. They took advantage of their patron's visit to ask that some provision be made for the well-being of their souls.
This cairn marks the spot where Lord Selkirk met with the settlers in the spring of 1817, and at that time they asked him for a minister to be sent out to them, and he said he would arrange for that. Died before he was able to send out a Presbyterian, which is what they were hoping for. What they got, of course, was the Reverend John West in 1820, an Anglican, and for 30 years the Selkirk settlers were ministered to by the Anglican Church.
For the Scottish settlers, the Presbyterian Church was an important part of their identity. Unfortunately for them, after Selkirk's untimely death, responsibility for his colony fell to the Hudson's Bay Company itself, which was largely English and Anglican. While it was Selkirk who suggested that the colony's first church should be located at this site, it was the Anglicans who got to follow through on the plan and established St. John's Church here.
The first church was built in 1822. It was of Red River frame. It, however, was severely weakened, if not destroyed, by the 1826 flood. Notwithstanding, they turned to and they built a stone church in 1832. It got done in by the 1850 flood, so they rebuilt again. And the third church on this site was the first one actually built as a cathedral in the early 1860s, and then this church, the one in which we're sitting, was built in 1926 and really got rolling in 1927.
The Scottish Presbyterians and English Anglicans of the colony shared St. John's Church and Cemetery for many years, in spite of their very different styles and practices.
David Jones, who was the second missionary here, he succeeded John West, noted in his diary that the Presbyterian members of the congregation stood to pray and sat to sing, while the Anglican members of the congregation knelt to pray and stood to sing, so that there was this constant up and down, and he got seasick.
Soon after Selkirk's death, the Hudson's Bay and Northwest Companies decided to bury the hatchet. The battle at Seven Oaks had been a shock to both sides, one that showed how their cutthroat competition had gotten out of hand and threatened the fur trade itself. In 1821, the two companies merged to become a single entity under the Hudson's Bay Company name. Fort Gibraltar was renamed Fort Garry, and Fort Douglas was abandoned. With these developments, the seed sown at Seven Oaks could finally begin to take root in the rich soil of the Canadian prairie. With peace in the fur trade, Seven Oaks prospered. The community grew as the Hudson's Bay Company employees exchanged their nomadic existence for the stability of agriculture and commerce. The survival of the colony in its earliest days had been partly due to the hardy nature of the Scottish settlers and partly to the assistance they received from the natives of the region, led by Chief Peguis.
Had it not been for Peguis and his people, the Selkirk settlers probably would have given up and left. They wouldn't have known how to survive on this land, because Peguis taught them how to hunt, how to use native flowers and vegetables for medicines and food and the rest. So Peguis should get more credit for Winnipeg than he gets.
In fact, the Scottish and Aboriginal communities became closely integrated as many settlers and retired fur traders married native women. Together, they built a thriving, vibrant, and unique society. And to meet the needs of their growing community, some of the more enterprising members turned to commerce, becoming the first private merchants on the prairie. One of these was John Ingster, a retired HBC employee who married a native woman named Mary Sinclair and became perhaps the most prosperous farmer and merchant in Seven Oaks. The Ingsters' home, built in 1853, is called Seven Oaks House and is named after the same group of trees as the famous battle, which had taken place just a stone's throw away. The house is now operated as a museum by the City of Winnipeg and illustrates the level of comfort and convenience the residents of the area had achieved by the mid-1800s. Attached to the house is the store, where John Ingster sold the increasing number of agricultural and household goods required by the growing settlement. John and Mary had 9 children, and their descendants played an important role in the development of the settlement into a city. The most notable of these was their son, Colin Ingster, who would serve in the first Manitoba legislature and then enjoy 50 years as the province's high sheriff. Colin Ingster's home is also still standing. Called Bleak House because of the absence of trees surrounding it when it was constructed, its property is now far from bleak, and the house is today used as a senior center. 1851 was an important year for the colony's Scottish settlers. The Reverend John Black arrived from Britain, and the Presbyterians finally had a minister of their own faith.
Yeah, to the Selkirk settlers who came, as you know, in 1812 or so to begin with, the 40 years that followed before they got their minister, they likened to the time the children of Israel were in the wilderness with Moses.
The arrival of John Black meant that the Presbyterians could begin the construction of their own church, which they located at the opposite end of the colony from St. John's. The church's design is based on the original in the parish of Kildonan in Scotland, and it remains standing to this day.
The pews you see in the church are not original to the building. Originally, the church was divided into a series of boxes known as box pews, and there was one for each family who wanted to rent them. They were rented on an annual basis, and that provided the income for the church. They didn't take up collections in those days. The closer you sat to the front, the more you paid for your pew.
Even after 40 years in a new country, the Selkirk settlers remained attached to their heritage, and their homeland is fondly recalled on the headstones of many of those who journeyed from Scotland and found their final resting place on the Canadian prairie. But the future would be anything but peaceful. As their community grew and began to attract the attention of others, Seven Oaks would once again find itself on the front line as the Maytee under Louis Riel once again raised the question of who should rule the West. With the Confederation of Canada in 1867, the prairies became economically and politically vital to the future of the new country. Recognizing that traditional Maytee rights were in jeopardy as political control shifted from the HBC to the new government in Ottawa, Louis Riel seized Upper Fort Garry and established a provisional government that would represent the interests of the region against the claims of newcomers from the east. The Scottish settlers found themselves in the middle of the conflict, torn by their sympathy for both sides.
Yeah, the story has it that the churchyard was used as an assembly point for a ragtag unofficial militia who were intent on assaulting the upper fort and getting rid of Riel and his cohorts. I've got to believe that there was some ambivalence about that, perhaps, with John Black and many of the people of Kildonan intermarried with the Aboriginal people of the area.
They also provided the first casualty in what is now known as the First Riel Rebellion.
The story also has it that there was a Maytee prisoner who was held in the church building overnight while he was being transported. He escaped, and in doing so killed the son of Hugh Sutherland, a very prominent Selkirk settler. This caused tremendous anguish and grief in the community, and indeed Hugh Sutherland actually went into the city, into the upper fort, to meet with Louis Riel, to urge him and beg him to end the conflict and the violence and settle the dispute in other ways.
Riel's execution of Thomas Scott gave his enemies the excuse they needed to take strong action, and he fled soon after the province of Manitoba joined Confederation in 1870. With the incorporation of the city of Winnipeg 3 years later, the seed sown at Seven Oaks began to bloom. But even as the city expanded, the Seven Oaks area remained culturally and politically significant. St. John's College and Manitoba College, established by the Anglican and Presbyterian churches, made Seven Oaks the educational center of the province. St. John's Ravenscourt's Boys' School, the University of Manitoba, and the University of Winnipeg all trace their roots back to Seven Oaks. St. John's Cathedral would remain the most prestigious house of worship for Winnipeg's Anglican elite, and many of those who built the city can be found in its cemetery.
Now this is Orkney John Ingster. John came out to the Red River in the early 1800s. He worked for the Hudson's Bay, and then he set up in business for himself, and he was a very successful businessman. And of course, the father of Ingster everything in Winnipeg, Ingster School, Ingster Gardens, Ingster Boulevard, you name it. And we've got a lot of Ingster stuff.
John Ingster's son Colin is buried on the other side of St. John's. Both men were wardens of the church in addition to being leading citizens. Colin Ingster is one of the few church members to be immortalized in its stained glass windows.
This is William Luxton, who came here in the 1860s from England. He was the first public school teacher in Manitoba, and he also was the founder of what is now the Winnipeg Free Press. I love this. On the side it just says, "and Sarah Jane, his wife." It makes me mad because he wouldn't have been able to do all the stuff he did if Sarah Jane hadn't been holding down the home front. This is Sir John Christian Schultz. Now his claim to fame is that he was the fellow who was clapped up by Louis Riel in Fort Garry and escaped and went to Ottawa to garner support to put down the Red River Rebellion of 1870. He eventually became an MP, a senator, a lieutenant governor of Manitoba, died full of honors in 1905 in California, and was carted back to Winnipeg to be buried. And the Ashdowns have a very spectacular edifice over their graves, but they were very important people in the development of Winnipeg. James and his brother founded the Ashdown Company, which went for many, many years. They started out as tin merchants and eventually, of course, expanded into all lines of hardware.
Many familiar names from the streets and history of Winnipeg can be found on headstones throughout the cemetery.
This is the grave, the oldest marked grave in the cemetery. The grave of Sir George Simpson's son, George Geddes Simpson, who died when he was 8 months old in 1832. And he was the son of George Simpson and his wife Frances. George was the governor of the Hudson's Bay.
The most impressive monument in St. John's Cemetery is undoubtedly the one commemorating John Norquay, Premier of Manitoba from 1878 to 1886.
John Norquay was to the west side of the river what Louis Riel was on the east side of the river. He was the spokesperson for this community and very well respected.
Norquay's status demonstrates how influential the Maytee were in the province's early days. However, that influence would quickly diminish as English-speaking immigrants began to flood into the province. And in Seven Oaks, these newcomers found a powerful symbol.
The significance of the monument to the Battle of Seven Oaks is very important, I think. The monument was erected in 1891 by the Manitoba Historical Society and with the support of the Selkirk heirs, only 21 years after the founding of the province of Manitoba. The erection of the monument so early in Manitoba's past represented the perceived victory of the post-1880 Anglo elite over the wild and untamed West they felt were represented by Métis culture and history.
The Battle of Sevenoaks is also viewed by the Métis as a central event in the development of their own identity, which has had a profound impact on the history of Manitoba. In fact, it could be said that everyone and everything in Western Canada has its roots in the people and events that make Sevenoaks such a significant chapter in our history. But more than that, the spirit of the people who settled this land, fought for this land, and built a new society upon it lives on in the proud, independent character of Western Canadians.
The more I learn about them, the more respect I have for their spirit and their determination. You have to call it courage. They didn't give up. And I think in many, many ways, that's determined the kind of character of Western Canadians, at least in the 3 prairie provinces, that you don't give up. You just dig your heels in and start all over again. And that's what they did, and they did it over and over and over again.